The War of 1812, a second war for American independence. The United States underwent dramatic changes during the period of Democratic Republican leadership, also known as Jeffersonian Republicanism, or simply Republican. Under this leadership, during the first decades of the 19th century, we'll see the Republic's expansion to the West, with renewed military conflict with Indian nations and Great Britain. These each would pose a fundamental challenge to this fragile new republic. All three of these factors will play a role in the coming of the War of 1812. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 intensified American migration to the West that was already well underway. Anglo-American settlement in the 18th century had largely been confined, though, to the eastern seaboard. This purchase, it actually made its boldest inroads where rivers allowed easy internal transportation. As a result, the chief population centers of early North America were clustered on the coast along its major inland waterways. This rapid population growth and geographic expansion caused a great deal of conflict. Native Americans in the West resisted American intrusion and fought renewed wars in the early 19th century. Furthermore, the expansion of plantation slavery beyond the coastal southeast meant that huge numbers of slaves were forcibly moved to new territories. In spite of these enormous human costs, the overwhelming majority of white Americans saw westward expansion as a major opportunity to them. Access to Western land offered the promise of independence and prosperity to anyone willing to meet the hardships of frontier life. Most politicians of the era believed that the health of the Republic depended upon providing affordable land to ordinary white Americans. Among Jeffersonian Republicans, most popular policies was an expansionist agenda that encouraged Western development. This played an important part in cementing the Democratic Republican Party's strength in the South and the West. While Western movement and policies were reshaping the Republic, European wars also presented a major challenge to our new country. The Napoleonic Wars, which happened roughly between 1802 and 1815, were a continuation of the conflict begun in the 1790s when Great Britain led a coalition of European powers against revolutionary forces. Though France was now led by the brilliant military strategist Napoleon Bonaparte. It's also true in the 1790s, neither European superpower respected the neutrality of the United States. So what I want to get across is that neither France nor Great Britain accepted that the United States wanted to remain neutral in these wars. Both France and Great Britain failed to recognize the Americans as being truly neutral in their war. And in fact, in response to this denial of neutrality, President Jefferson and his Secretary of State, James Madison, would craft an imaginative but fundamentally flawed policy of economic coercion. President Jefferson and his Secretary of State had come up with an idea that they would not supply either side. That they would prevent U.S. ships from trade with Europe in the belief that the dependence on American goods by European powers would soon force France and England to honor America's neutrality. Well, this embargo of 1807 actually backfires. The Republican leaders failed to understand how deeply committed the superpowers, France and Britain, were to carrying on their war despite the high costs. This unsuccessful strategy mostly punished Americans because it helped to spur a Federalist revival in the elections of 1808 and 1812. If you think about it, what happens here is that we say we're not going to sell to anybody in Europe during this time period, just keep us neutral. But all it does is punish American merchants, American manufacturers, because they're not able to sell anymore to either side under this embargo. Nevertheless, even with this flawed embargo, Republicans from Virginia continue to hold the presidency as James Madison replaces Jefferson as President of the United States in 1808. Now, Madison will face difficult circumstances in office with increasing Indian violence in the West and warlike conditions in the Atlantic. These combination of forces will push him away from his policy of economic coercion, this embargo, toward an outright declaration of war. This intensification towards war with all parties is favored by a group of U.S. Westerners and Southerners in Congress called war hawks, who were led by Henry Clay of Kentucky, pictured here in your slide. These war hawks are angry with the British, primarily for many reasons. First of all, the British didn't withdraw from American territory in the Great Lakes region, as they had agreed to in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolution. In addition, Britain kept aiding Native Americans here in the United States, arming them with weapons, actually causing a lot of trouble for settlers, right, on the frontier, with these Native Americans having weapons supplied by the British. In addition, Britain would not sign favorable commercial agreements with the U.S., so whatever trade was taking place, the U.S. felt we weren't getting favorable trade conditions from Great Britain. In addition to those items I just mentioned regarding the British failing to withdraw from territory after the Revolution and them aiding Native Americans and not signing favorable commercial agreements, the British do something that's really seen as an act of hostility. This is called impressment. Basically, Britain claimed the right to take away any British sailors serving on American merchant ships. In practice, the British took many American sailors and forced them to serve on British ships. This was for all practical purposes kidnapping. And in addition, in 1807, the British ship Leopard will fire on an American ship Chesapeake. Other American merchant ships came under harassment from the British Navy. War hawks in Congress will push for conflict and will push for a war against Great Britain. Now let's talk about Native Americans in the Trans-Appalachian West here in the United States. As we know, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the first white settlers in America inhabited the eastern seaboard. There, the whites either made treaties with the Native American groups to buy land, or they forcibly took Indian land. By the Revolution's end, and on into the early 19th century, Native Americans were being displaced across the Appalachians and toward what is today the Midwest. For these exile groups, there were few places to go for them. Outright military conflict with Native groups in the Northwest preceded the formal declaration of war of 1812. In fact, some would say the War of 1812 is a Western war in many ways amongst Indian nations, choosing between allying with the British against the Americans or allying with the Americans against the British. Now, this growing Indian force will threaten American plans to move west and seemed especially dangerous to Americans since the Native Americans received economic and military support from the British in Canada. Now, the War of 1812, like I mentioned, is a Western war, but we could argue that the War of 1812 is a Western war with Eastern labels. This means that the real causes of the war stem from desire for control of Western Indian lands and clear access to trade through New Orleans. In the War of 1812, the United States once again fought against the British and their Indian allies, much like the American Revolution. Some historians, including myself, see the conflict as a second war for American independence. The 3-year war marks a traditional boundary between the early Republic and early national period. Although the War of 1812 serves as an important turning point in the development of an independent United States, the war itself was mostly a political and military disaster for our country. The U.S. Congress was far from unanimous in its declaration of war. In fact, America's initial invasion of Canada, then ruled by England, in the summer of 1812 was repulsed, turned back by Tecumseh and the British. The U.S. was unable to mount a major invasion of Canada because of significant domestic discord over war policy, meaning American politicians couldn't agree on how to handle this war. Most importantly, the governors of most New England states refused to allow their state militias to join a campaign beyond state boundaries, New England states were not going to send soldiers for this war. Similarly, a promising young congressman from New Hampshire, Daniel Webster, actually discouraged enlistment in the U.S. Army during this war. This is not our proudest moment, this War of 1812. During the War of 1812, British military dominance was even clearer in the Atlantic, and Britain's naval superiority allowed it to deliver a shaming blow to the fragile United States in the summer of 1814. With Napoleon's French forces failing in Europe, Britain committed more of its resources to the American War, and in August sailed up the Potomac River to occupy Washington, D.C., and actually burn the White House. Here we have an artist's rendition of the British Army marching down the streets in Washington, D.C. and burning down buildings, including our Capitol. On the edge of national bankruptcy and with the Capitol largely in ashes, total American disaster was averted when the British failed to capture Fort McHenry, then protected by nearby Baltimore. While watching this failed attack on Fort McHenry, a prisoner of the British, Francis Scott Key, he would write a poem later called The Star-Spangled Banner, which was set to the tune of an English drinking song. And as we all know, that poem would be put with the tune, and we would know it now as our national anthem of the United States. This will actually become the national anthem of the United States in 1931. On the next slide, I actually have the original song, and it's an old drinking song talking about Bacchus and wine and drinking and frivolity. So I just want you to think about that for our Star-Spangled Banner. The music is actually from an old drinking song.
To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be. When this answer arrived from that jolly old Grecian, voice, fiddle, and flute no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name and inspire you to boot. And besides, I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine.
And besides, I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine.
Ye sons of Anacreon, then join hand in hand, preserve unanimity, friendship, and love. 'Tis yours to support what's so happily planned. You've the sanction of gods and the fiat of Jove. While thus we agree, our toast let it be, may our club flourish happy, united, and free. And long may the sons of Anacreon entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine.
Was sung in their club room, they joyfully entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine.
What you just heard were the first and last verses done in club style of To Anacreon in Heaven, which also became known as the Anacreontic Song. This melody really took off. People took great interest in it. By the 1790s, there was a move to introduce women members into the club, which became such a controversy that the club itself folded forever. Rather ironic if we go back to the women and wine thing, if you think about it.
The War of 1812 came to an end largely because the British public had grown tired of the sacrifice and expense of their 20-year war against France. Now that Napoleon was all but finally defeated, the minor war against the United States and North America lost popular support. If you want to think about it, think about if your son or your cousin or your father is in the British Army and they are in the New World, in the United States, fighting. You're wondering, what are we doing there? Why are we supporting this? Didn't we already fight them in that revolution? We were dealing with Napoleon in France. We won that war. Why are we still in the United States? So the British support for this war, of course, diminishes. And we actually see the British come to a truce and a treaty with the United States. This treaty is known as the Treaty of Ghent. The negotiations begin in August of 1814. On Christmas Eve, the treaty is actually signed in Belgium. Now, I do want you to remember one thing, though. While the popular memory of the War of 1812 may have been dour and not so glorious, because in all actuality, the United States didn't really do too well in this. The main reason we got out of it is because Great Britain grew tired of war here in the New World. But there is one glimmer. Although the peace treaty had already been signed, remember it's signed on Christmas Eve in Belgium, there is one battle here in the New World that the United States actually wins. General Andrew Jackson will actually go into battle with a decisive victory in New Orleans, resulting in 700 British casualties versus only 13 American deaths. And this is known as the Battle of New Orleans. Now, once again, I want you to think about the timing. The peace treaty with Great Britain takes place on Christmas Eve, 1814. This battle, the Battle of New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson, actually happens on January the 8th, 1815. The battle happened a week after we were already at peace with Great Britain. Of course, the Battle of New Orleans had no military or diplomatic significance, but what it did do is it allowed Americans to have a little bit of a swagger with a claim of a great win by Andrew Jackson, even though it was after the peace treaty had been signed. Further, the victory does launch the public career of Andrew Jackson as a new kind of American leader, totally different from those who had guided the nation through the Revolution and the early Republic. The Battle of New Orleans vaunted Jackson to a heroic status, a war hero status, and he became a symbol of the new American nation emerging in the early 19th century. Andrew Jackson becomes one of our first modern war heroes, although the battle happened after the peace treaty had been signed. At the end of the War of 1812, we see a growth and expansion and social change rapidly increase here in the United States. We see a sense of nationalism sweeping throughout the country, being proud to be an American. Nationalism is that belief and sense of pride in one's country based on its achievements. And in fact, the nation will embark on foreign trade and begin to build a transportation system that it had not seen prior. Native American resistance will be removed from the Ohio River Valley permanently, opening the Midwest for expansion. Many an enterprising American will push westward, and in these new western states there was a great level of equality among the masses than in the former English colonies. That is, of course, if you were white. Land was readily available. Frontier life was hard and required hard work to succeed. There was little tolerance for aristocrats, people that weren't willing to get dirt under their fingernails. This was the new West. This was the new frontier. This is the new America.